I wanted to ask you a bit about attention and whether you would describe attention as the same thing as mind and ego, because I feel that those things only exist through the attention that's given to them. Yet when mind is brought into the heart, or attention, you could say, that one pointed attention sort of dissolves, really.
Just about. Question was, and this is a kind of intellectual question, but that's okay. The question was, attention, is that the ego? Or is that the mind? And I guess what's implied is that, or is that the self? Because we talk of the self as being consciousness. Well, I mean, I can give you an answer straight away, you know, within the context of the teaching. But let's figure it out. Let's see what you can figure out. Matthew, if you, I can't remember, is it Matthew or Matt? Or
Matt's fine, yeah.
Matt, okay. So yeah, you've unmuted yourself, awesome. So what, according to the teachings, the verbal teachings, are the characteristics of the self versus characteristics of non-self? Do you know? Or am I putting you on the spot too much?
Well, self is just existence and being.
Yes.
And non-self is the idea that there's not existence and there is someone, a doer, more to that.
Yes. And okay, so what we could say there are lots of different traditional ways of looking at it, which can be quite useful in helping you, each of you here on the call, answer these kinds of questions. If you're not sure, oh, is that the self, or is this ego, or is this something else? I'm not sure. You know, attention, place your attention on yourself. What is this attention? Is that the self, or is that ego, or is that mind? What is it? So one way of looking at it is, if something is transient, it's non-self. If something's eternal, it's self. If something's movement, that's non-self. If something's not moving, still is the opposite of movement, right? If it's something still, that's self, or more likely to be self. So if something, it has limitation, that's non-self. If there's no limitation, that's self. Both self and non-self have being, kind of, because what we find out is self is just pure being, and then non-self is, it kind of hijacks that sense of being and then makes itself into a limited form. So non-self are all the objects, anything that's seen, anything that's perceived, and self is the perceiver, the knower, the subject. So attention, what is that? Because that feels like it's a bit in between. But actually attention is the ego. It's a subtle form of the ego. Now the ego is non-existent. There is only consciousness. So when we say something is ego or something is non-self, like if we take, I've got a glass of water here. I've got a glass of water. This glass is non-self. It's an object. But there's a reality underpinning this object, which is the consciousness. So it's also consciousness as well, but we call it non-self. We call it non-self for the purposes of the teaching. So these teachings are for the ego. These practices are for the ego. Does the self need a teaching? The self does not need a teaching. It's whole and complete. It's what you already are. But the ego is the one that suffers, that thinks it's limited, that thinks it has a form, that worries, that is trying to get somewhere, is trying to become enlightened. Okay, all that is illusion. The ego is interested in objects in the world. It's trying to attain something, maybe something like enlightenment. So these teachings are for the ego. Now, the ego is thinking and all that egoic thought, but it's also the attention. So, for example, if you desire something, if you desire something, an object, a worldly object, your attention will go towards it. If you're really interested in shoes, say you really like buying shoes, you might notice everyone's shoes when you're walking down the street. You walk down the street, you notice everyone's shoes. Say you're into jackets, then you might notice everyone's jackets. If you're into cars, you might notice all the cars that go past. You might, if you're into aeroplanes, you might notice all the aeroplanes. Whereas if you're not interested in aeroplanes, you might not notice aeroplanes that much. If you're not interested in shoes, not interested in jackets, not interested in cars, you might not notice those things. Your attention, this is your attention. You see, Matt? So this is the ego. And what happens is that over the course of life, we start to get wise to desiring objects. We start to realize that some of these objects that we thought would give us lasting happiness don't. But then we think other ones will. So maybe you realize that a computer game won't give you lasting satisfaction. And so you become less interested in computer games, maybe, as you get older. But you think something else is going to be much better. Maybe you become less interested in pop music, and now you're more interested in jazz. You're more sophisticated. So your attention, what the objects that you place your attention on to change. But with spirituality, we start to realize all these objects are ultimately empty. They don't give us a sense of fullness. They never complete us. And we realize the only source of our happiness is within our own self. So when we start to realize that more and more, that the source of our happiness doesn't come from the objects, it actually comes from ourselves. And there's a whole load of logic that underpins this teaching that I haven't gone into. It's all in the chapter on happiness, one of the earliest chapters in the Path of Sri Ramana. You can read through that. Then what happens once we realize the source of happiness is ourselves? Our attention naturally goes to ourselves. And as our ego attention, subtle form of ego, tends to ourself, as it goes in and in and in, inwards, it transforms into the self. What do I mean by that? I mean, it loses its form. It loses its limiting adjuncts. It loses sense of limitation. And figuratively speaking, it merges into Atman. Atman means the self. And as the ego or attention merges into Atman, it can feel like the whole world is merging into Atman. Because we discover the whole world is predicated on this ego I. It doesn't necessarily make sense logically, but when you experience, you realize this. So the attention is the ego. It's moving, it's an object, it's a phenomena. You have a sense of control over it. It's part of Maya. But it's a part of Maya that the teaching uses. And it's this, because you're taking yourself to be the ego, I. So you think it's your attention. You turn it inwards, you discover what you are. The name and form will go away, and what you're left with is the pure self. All teachings are for the ego. But the ego is the self. When you turn it around, it's just the self. Shankara actually talks about this in his commentaries on the Upanishads. Shankara wrote many commentaries on some of the most important Upanishads. And he talks about how we are to take our attention, essentially, and turn it inwards and merge. He uses the word merge or dissolve everything into the self. He says, just like a lump of salt, I think he's salt or sugar, I think it's a lump of salt, he says, dissolves in water and its name and form disappear. You've got a lump of salt, which has a definite form, and you dissolve it in water, the name and form disappear, and it merges, becomes one with consciousness. But the essence of it doesn't disappear. The salt, when you taste the water, it tastes salty. The essence of the salt has not disappeared. And so the ego, in essence, is the self. But we grasp the name and the form, so it appears to be limited. But when you turn it inward, you merge or dissolve everything into the self, into pure consciousness, then only the essence remains. That's what we are. This is kind of alchemy. Shankara really beautifully drums this point home over in his commentaries on the Upanishads. He takes every verse by verse and he builds to a crescendo in each chapter. And at the end of most chapters, he'll sort of explain the teaching. And then the beginning of the next chapter, he'll summarize the teaching. And then he'll do the same thing again. You get a crescendo as you read his commentaries, explaining all this teaching to you. But I'd say the same teaching, just in a very simplified form. The same teaching, though.